What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. In this video, I'm going to explain how bass move during the spawn on 3 different lake types: Highland reservoirs, river systems, and lowland reservoirs. Let's get into it. First up, we have Beaver Lake here in Arkansas. Beaver Lake is a Highland reservoir and is pretty interesting in a couple of ways. One, the lake is kind of flipped on its head from how you would normally think about a lake. The clear water in the dam is up north, and then down south you have the dirty water river section. We could spin this around to kind of give you guys a more standard view of what other reservoirs like this look like, where you have, again, the lower end is the dam, and that's the clear water, and the upper end is the dirty water. And this is really important during the spawn time of the year, because bass are going to spawn at different times based on the section of lake and the water visibility. So for example, in this image, we're looking at a drawn down-ish version of Beaver Lake. It might not always look like this, but it's good for showing you what the banks look like on Google Earth. And on the lower end here, you have anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 10 feet of water visibility at times. In this situation, the water is going to warm up a lot slower in the spring when you have this deep, clear water. In a lot of places on Beaver Lake, you have over 100 feet of water, and so with all that water, it takes a while for it to warm up, especially when it's so clear and there's not a lot of sediment in the water. However, if we move up to the upper end of the lake, that is more in the river arm, you have a lot shallower water. Maybe these creeks in the center of the creek channel are in 50 feet of water, so you have half the water. And you also have a lot more sediment in the water, which is going to allow the water to warm up a little bit quicker as temperatures rise in the spring. This means you might find water temperatures up this river arm in some of these creeks in the 60s, let's say 65-degree water temperature up here, up the river, when the water temperatures are still 55, 56 degrees down on the lower end where it's clear. This is going to cause the bass to spawn at completely different times. There are times, at least in Arkansas, where you'll find bass spawning as early as late March into kind of early April on the upper end of Beaver Lake. And then on the lower end, they might not start spawning until the middle of April, and they might spawn all the way through the middle of May. So you'll have spawning bass across your lake, and obviously if you get to more of like the mid-lake section, which is kind of a cross between the two, the bass will spawn at a different time there as well. Also, the water can be clearer or dirtier in certain creeks and certain arms, so maybe there's one creek up here that is clearer than another, and that'll warm up slower. So there's all these factors you need to take into account with the spawn. In addition, fluctuating water can delay whether the fish are going to spawn or not. If you have the lake rising or falling really quickly, then the fish may or may not actually want to commit to spawning. So for example, if the water is at this water level and water temperatures hit 60 degrees, which is kind of that like magic number for them to spawn, what'll happen is that they might think about laying their beds, down these bank lines, maybe on some of these rocks or whatever. And then if the water came up, let's say really quickly over a couple of weeks, that's going to throw off their entire situation, because they were going to spawn way out here on some deeper banks, but instead now the water has come up, and so instead of these rocks right here, if we kind of highlight those being where they're going to spawn, now if we take the lake back to more of a full pool, now they might want to lay their beds right in here. And they'll delay their spawn until that water stabilizes. And so even though the water temperatures might even be 68 to 70 degrees, and the water has just risen 5 feet or 3 feet or 2 feet, the bass may not have spawned yet because they're waiting for that water to stabilize. So these are all factors that kind of are important to take into account. Obviously, there's a lot of other things with the moon phase and all of these other factors, but those are kind of 2 main things I pay attention to more than anything. The water level stability, if it's stable water, and if the water temperatures are in that like 60-ish degree range. Now, right now on Beaver Lake in particular, the water temperatures are actually 60 degrees up this river, but they were like 48 degrees just like last week. So the water temperatures rose 15 degrees in a week from a bunch of warm weather, but the moon phase wasn't quite there yet. So the fish aren't quite spawning yet. So it's kind of a weird deal, but getting to like where these bass will spawn, in general, what I like to look for, especially when I go up these river arms, is I'm trying to find larger spawning flats. So a spawning flat to me is any place where you have a large expanse of water and you have a little bit harder bottom. So if we take a look at this area here, under a normal pool, it's actually still a little bit kind of normal. So this is kind of like a higher pool. This is actually flood pool, but it happens on Beaver a lot. You'll see that there's a lot of water that can set up here. It can also set up in this middle range, or it can be completely dry. But these types of flats, if there isn't enough water here, are great places for these bass to pull up and spawn because there's a lot of nice flat water. They can lay their beds very easily, and in addition to all of that, they're protected a lot of times by these chunks of land, little islands, things like that. In here, there's a lot of timber and things as well, so they can lay their eggs and things like that at the base of a tree or a bush or something like that, which is going to help the eggs kind of stay protected from predators. In addition, they may not just only be on the little bushes and stick-ups, they might want to lay their eggs on some harder bottom areas. So for example, right here we have an old house foundation, and this is a great little spot. It's a sneaky beaver spot for anyone who fishes beaver, but there's a little old house foundation, and that harder bottom right there is a great place for these bass to spawn. You bring the water up to normal pool, you would never expect there to be anything there, but that's where these bass will lay their eggs. It's very flat water, so you're going to a lot of times have to mark these areas off, especially if it's kind of dirtier water, and just kind of make a lot of pitches through that zone, maybe marking it with waypoints or whatever you can do. And these are kind of the sneaky zones where a lot of these fish are going to be spawning. But they can also just spawn, again, on these like random stick-ups and trees and things that are in the water. Now, these are the areas I like to look for on this upper end because you'll find more of those shallower flats on these Highland reservoirs. And there's a few in this area. Here's a nice little creek that, again, is a little bit clearer, which a lot of times means that the fish will maybe spawn a little bit later just because of the clear water. But again, another nice flat that's sticking out here that is a little bit shallower and has, again, these little hard spots. A little hard spot here. You have some nice little rock right here. These are places these bass will pull up to spawn, even these little slightly rockier banks down the back of this creek. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in this spawning time of the year on the upper end of these lakes. Now, as we move down to the lower end of these lakes, I change my approach a little bit. Beaver is actually interesting because there are multiple species in this lake of bass. You have spotted bass, smallmouth, and largemouth. On the upper end here, you're dealing mainly with largemouth, 90% are largemouth, maybe 10% spotted bass. As you get further down the lake, you get a mix of all three in pretty even numbers from what I've found. For the largemouth, what I like to look for, we're actually going into the backs of the creeks where you have a little bit dirtier water. So even though you're on this upper end of the lake, a lot of times there will be some creeks that have a little bit dirtier water, a little bit of runoff. And I'll go back in the backs of these creeks. What I'm looking for in particular for the largemouth is slate rock. If you can find slate rock on these Highland reservoirs, you are going to absolutely crush them. So what I mean by slate rock, I'm going to try to find some around here, is rock that is more kind of has flat places for these fish to set up on. So you see these big rocks, they have nice flat spots. This is where a lot of these bass like to spawn in this dirtier water, and you can find them either just sight fishing for them or just fishing down the bank with a jig and a Texas rig and stuff like that. But if you can find these areas where you have these flat rocks, that's where a lot of these fish like to set their beds up on. You can find fish obviously back in just like little pockets and coves and all kinds of stuff as well, but they're a little bit harder just to fish for. If you want to try to find spawning fish that you want to sight fish for, these flatter pockets and the backs of these flatter coves, a lot of times these can be better sight fishing areas, but I don't like to sight fish very much myself. I prefer to just kind of blind fish for the bass. And when I'm blind fishing, this slate rock, or the rock that's a little bit more jagged, is what I've found the most success with over the years. So let me try to find another pocket that has that kind of slate rock. You can kind of see here, again, really nice rock that has really flat, long rocks. That's what a lot of those largemouth I find will spawn on, and I really like fishing this sort of stuff. Just pitch into it, finding where that edge drops off. Maybe like a lot of times they'll spawn right where that ledge is, where you have the edge of a rock, and then there's like a little shelf, and they can lay their eggs there, and then it drops into deeper water. But this is the type of stuff I'm looking for on a lot of these Highland reservoirs, especially as you get more towards the lower end of the lake. You can catch them like that as well on the upper end, but I find that I just have more success in the flats on the upper end in general in that dirtier water. Now, for smallmouth bass, it's very different. Smallmouth are going to spawn on pea gravel points. So pea gravel points are basically points that have small little rock. So not the big chunk rock, but just the smaller rocks like this. And they're going to be these rounded points. And these smallmouth will spawn out here on these really round points. And they'll lay their eggs sometimes as deep as 15 to 20 feet of water in this zone because the water's so clear. The light will penetrate all the way down to 15 to 20 feet, and they'll lay their eggs on these pea gravel points. The way you can fish for these fish are twofold. One, you can use a flogger, which is basically a traffic cone that has some glass through it, and you can like look down on them and then try to sight fish. And I don't do that, but you could. Or you can just get in these areas and blind cast with a tube, a Ned rig, and a drop shot. That's my preferred method. Just fishing around these points, putting your boat in maybe 30 feet of water, casting up into 15 and 10, 15 foot and working it back. And these smallmouth don't get picked on all that much because a lot of guys are trying to fish the bank this time of year rather than fishing off these rounded pea gravel points, and you can absolutely smash them. You can just find any of these pea gravel points around like this, or places that don't have a ton of chunk rock. This point even has a little bit more chunk rock than I would even like. I really like just the flat pea gravel where there's not much else going on other than the gravel itself. So that is kind of what I look for the smallmouth. Spotted bass, kind of a little bit of a mix of both. You can catch, mainly the spotted bass are going to be more towards the bank on those slate rock and things like that, but I usually don't target spotted bass anyways that much because I just like to catch, at least on my lakes, there's not as many big spotted bass, so I like to catch the better quality fish, which on my lakes are the smallmouth and the largemouth. So that is how I would target a Highland reservoir. Now, Highland reservoirs are not the end-all be-all. We also have river systems. So next up, we're going to take a look at Lake Dardanelle here. This is off the Arkansas River. It's actually part of the Arkansas River, but it's more of a river system-ish lake, so I want to talk about this as well. So with this fishery, what you're looking for are two different things, at least from what I've had the most success with. The first is trying to find riprap. So riprap is going to a lot of times be at the mouth of little creeks and pockets and things like that. And again, I'm not a big sight fisherman, so there are places like on Lake Dardanelle where you can go sight fish in some of these old like gravel strip pits where it's super clear and stuff like that, but I just don't really mess with that. That's not my favorite thing. I prefer to fish roads and riprap. And I actually won a Arkansas Junior State Championship when I was fishing the junior Bassmaster level, flipping in April a black neon tube on all of these roads. And basically these fish will spawn around these roads and around the rocks. And the best place to look for these fish are actually right where the roads transition from the pea gravel or the riprap to kind of just a regular bank. And in that transition, the bank will flatten out a little bit. And a lot of these fish will set up either on the edges of these grass areas or right on the edge of that rock. And a lot of the fish are not going to be right up against the rock. They're going to be out in front of the rock, about a third to a half of a cast off the bank. And so what I would do is actually go right behind all these other fishermen who are go fishing right tight to the rocks. And I would stay just like 5-10 feet further off the bank and just fish a tube really slow. And I was absolutely hammering them. And so I won that tournament. I think I had four that went like 16 pounds, and I had like one 1-pounder, like a tiny like 14-incher, and I actually jumped off like a 4.5 at the boat, so I should have had over 20 pounds in that tournament, but I still won it by a decent margin. So that's kind of a deal I look for. And again, I've caught fish on all these different little riprap areas, right where that riprap kind of starts to transition right in through here, through here, through here. This is actually right here is where I lost that 4.5-pounder that was kind of a heartbreaker on that tube. But that's a really good, easy area to look for on these river systems. Another area is getting into some of the sketchier backwaters. And this is kind of the fun stuff that guys like to probably hear about. I'm actually going to go out to Lake Dardanelle tomorrow and try to run some of these backwaters, so wish me luck. But anyways, so what you can do with these backwaters is you want to find an area that is not necessarily super stumpy. So I don't go into like these type of backwaters too often, which is like Spadger Creek, where you have a lot of standing timber and where you can kind of get in here and start seeing like stick-ups and stumps and stuff like that. When you idle back here, it gets real sketchy. What I like to do instead is try to use Google Earth to find areas where you have lily pads on these river systems or some type of grass. So if you go back in time, you can actually see that Spadger used to have a bunch of lily pads. It doesn't anymore. And this is how you can, this is a sneaky deal on how to figure out how to get in these areas. So I'm about to spoil some secrets here, but go back in time on Google Earth. Look for the boat lanes. All of these little trails are boat lanes of guys running in and out of these areas. And you can figure out how I run these areas by watching the boat lanes and watching where guys are. And a lot of these old little backwater deals are just loaded. This is kind of more of a community hole anyways on Dardanelle, but like this is how you run into these areas, and these are the areas themselves. So you see there's not a lot of grass back up in here. And it takes a long time sometimes to kind of figure out what areas are good and what are not. But some of these areas even have little like clear water sections back here which the fish can load up in. But other times it's just fishing back up in here. And right now there's not a lot of pads on Dardanelle from what I remember. But it looks like there's more that's coming back. So I kind of hope when I get out there tomorrow there's like even some pad stems and some other stuff. But I'm going to just hopefully get back in here. Most of the time there's not as many stumps and stuff through here, knock on wood on that one. But getting back in these little backwaters and cuts and stuff can be very, very effective. And you find them by looking at, again, that Google Earth imagery. Now you can do the same thing. Here's another kind of chunk of islands. And depending on how risk-taking you are, you can run as sketchy as you want on these deals. But like, here's a big pad field, and you know, I used to run in here all the time, and there's like I would idle these. I always recommend idling because the sandbars move. There's like these sandbars like this all over, and you gotta be careful because year after year they move. And I haven't run back to this backwater in like, I don't know, 8 years, so maybe 6 years. So I'm gonna idle from the main river. Hopefully don't get stuck and have to get out and push, but you know, could happen. And then I'm going to try to get in this area where you, again, in the past would see these lily pads. There are lily pads all over. And then it kind of opens up in some of these areas back up in here. And this is where these fish are going to spawn, in these big backwater bays, backwater areas. And it can be very, very effective. Now, it's going to be really shallow back in here. It's going to be tricky to get in here at times. But I think from what I can see, there's still a good amount of like pad stems and just stuff. And so I'm hoping, again, fingers crossed, it's happening in here. This date is from 2023 in December, so maybe there's still some pads back in here. And a lot of times I'll actually fish in the pre-spawn, fishing through these pads with a spinnerbait and stuff, and then you get all the way back down in here, all the way to the back, and they can be all the way back into this stuff. Just trim that engine up and get back in there. So that is those river system type lakes. And then last but not least, we have lowland reservoirs. So lowland reservoirs are a little bit different from both because there's a lot flatter water. So this is Sam Rayburn Reservoir. I found an image when the lake is drawn down. This is a 2011 image, very famous for a lot of people because I show this all the time. But anyways, the thing about Highland reservoirs, there's a lot of places you can go and catch fish and lots of things you can do. But what I personally like to do, this is my personal opinion. Again, I don't like to sight fish, so I'm not sight fishing for fish. So what I have found that's been really effective for me is going into these creeks. And this creek here is just one of the major creeks, close to one of the major boat ramps, so it gets a lot of pressure. But you get back in here, and because we have this lake image drawn down, you can see a lot of the things that are under the water that you wouldn't normally be able to see. And you can also side image these things and find stuff on side imaging. But once you get way back in here, what you'll notice is that there are areas where this creek channel winds in here. So I'll try to zoom out. This creek channel winds through all the way through here. You get to these like really shallow back end areas. And in here, if you look really carefully, there are stumps. Now this is a sneaky deal, guys. So this is very sneaky. But these stumps right here, a lot of these bass are going to spawn on these stumps. And a lot of guys are just going to ignore these stumps and fish the bank. And that is a big mistake. So I'll mark these stumps again, Google Earth or on side scan. And then if you take the lake back up to normal pool, this is above normal pool. If you just do like a normal pool, normal day, let's see what that would be. I guess this is normal pool. You can see that these areas, they're not very deep. I bet all these areas I'm marking are in like maybe 3 to 4 foot of water at most. But you have these stumps out here. And they're kind of further off the bank than you would expect. A lot of these guys are going to be trying to fish up in these willows and in the bushes and all kinds of stuff. But a lot of those stumps are where those fish actually are going to end up spawning, especially with the water clarity permitting. And you have to kind of figure out what depth of these stumps are too deep. So there's more up in here. Stump, stump, stump. You can see a bunch of them through here. And you can go through all these creeks and you can find areas that have more stumps than others. And that's kind of how I pick a good creek when I'm trying to find these bass during this time of the year. So, I mean, again, a lot of these creeks in here don't have that many stumps as you get further out. So I wouldn't necessarily be as excited about these areas as I would other stretches. Now, another thing you can pay attention to on these these lowland reservoirs is the bottom composition. If you have Google Earth or, again, using side scan, you can figure out which banks have harder bottom and which ones don't. So, for example, this bank right here has more kind of sand on it, or a little bit harder bottom than the bank over here. You can see that brighter bottom composition. So these bass are more likely to spawn on this bank than they will on other banks. Now, this is a tricky situation because you'll find a lot of banks that have that right mix of, bottom composition, stuff like that. But what I really try to look for in particular are certain pockets and creeks where not the entire creek or the entire pocket is covered up with this harder bottom. You want to try to find isolated patches of that harder bottom. So getting into a creek or an area where most of the creek is softer bottom, and then you find a few stretches of harder bottom, like there's a little bit more hard bottom like right there, a little bit more hard bottom right there, a little bit more here, right here, so on and so forth. But most of it is kind of softer bottom. That is how you start differentiating the key little stretches from anything else. You get back into a big bay like this, and there's a few, old road beds, old things like that, but then you have a few patches of like harder bottom right there. A little bit of harder bottom right here with some stumps. Like that is ideal as long as it's not too deep with the lake back up. So like obviously with the lake back up, banks all the way out to here, but it's a pretty flat bay, so there may be fish spawning all the way out here. So a lot of times that's kind of what I'm looking for. I try to find these really subtle stretches and subtle areas like this and these harder stretches because I feel like it gives me an advantage over other anglers just going down the bank, beating the bank. I target these spots with very similar techniques that you would with other, things. I'm throwing Texas rigs, Carolina rigs sometimes if it's really deep, but mainly just a Texas rig down there, wacky rig, things like that. And I just get through these areas and I, have my waypoints I mark on there, mark them through here, this harder bottom, and then I'm going to take a wacky rig and I'm just going to work through that area nice and slow, targeting these key stretches until I kind of figure out the depth, how far back in the creek they are, and also, especially like we talked about earlier, which section of lake is better. To kind of reiterate that, for example, on a Rayburn, the lower end is deeper and clearer, so it's going to warm up slower than these upper reaches, these upper creeks and these dirtier water arms. So the fish will spawn sooner in those shallow, dirtier water sections and will spawn later, more on the main lake and more in that deeper, clearer water. So you have to kind of go to the lake in the spring a lot of times, especially when they're around the spawn, and try multiple sections of the lake. I probably wouldn't, if I was going to Rayburn, launch way up here in like this zone of the lake where you're kind of stuck up here, because there's a really good chance that the fish are either in like a post-spawn funk, they're in a pre-spawn funk, they're like on the bed but not really acting super great. And to run out of there, it's going to take a long time. Versus if you launched at the dam down here, you could run up one of these creek arms feasibly in a day, get up here, see if the fish are in the right position. Are they actively eating? Are they, actively locked on beds? Or are they in a funk? And then work your way back down to more the main lake, and maybe the fish are in a better mood there than they are up these creek arms. And you kind of want to keep an open mind on section of lake, water clarity, things like that, and give yourself a lot of options this time of year, because it really can make a big difference where you can go 4 miles up or down the lake, and on one stretch you might catch a fish every hour, and another stretch you're catching a fish every 10 minutes. So definitely change up the section of the lake, use some of the areas I talked about in this video, and I'm going to be doing a lot more videos breaking down these different areas. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you leave a comment down below, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.